Hey Planeswalkers, this is Eric, and I have a special announcement. The channel is changing. It was formerly Bane Alley Magic, but because I used way too many copyrighted songs and video clips, I've decided to start a new and more professional channel. The content will be the same, just no goofy music or random clips from my favorite movies. So I've ditched the old channel and started a new one, and the new channel is called Monk Punk Magic. So welcome Planeswalkers to the first episode of Monk Punk Magic, and today we are talking about a couple of new commanders, Kodama of the East Tree and Esior, Ward-Wing Familiar. So Kodama of the East Tree is 4 and 2 green for a 6/6 spirit with reach, and whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. Esior is 1 and a blue for a 1/3 bird with flying. Spells your opponent's cast that target one or more commanders you control cost 3 more to cast. So Kodama is a really great value card. Basically every single permanent you play from your hand ends up becoming a 2-for-1. Even lands. When you play a land and Kodama's on the battlefield, you can play then another land from your hand because lands are converted mana cost 0 and they're all permanents, right? So Kodama does work with lands. He can get you extra lands on the battlefield and extra creatures on the battlefield. Just great value inside of this one creature. Now many of you might ask, why Esior? Why not Sakashima or even Brenolin? The answer is simple. Esior is only 2 mana. Sakashima is good, but does not exactly create synergy with the deck unless she can become a copy of Kodama. And Brenolin is 8 mana, which is way too much when Kodama is already 6. So I like Esior because it's constant protection for our commander, and it's basically always available because it's in our command zone. That's really great because once you get your engine going with this deck, your opponents will have Kodama on the top of their hit list. So the theme of this deck is actually enter the battlefield triggers because Kodama triggers when a permanent enters the battlefield. So we got 45 creatures including our commanders. And then since this is a Panharmonicon deck, we gotta have some flicker effects or at least enter the battlefield multipliers. So of those cards we have 9. Creatures that can flicker themselves, we actually have 4 of those, which are really useful. We have 13 ramp spells. We have 21 card advantage spells. And that's really important with Kodama. We always want to have a full hand, so we always have something that we can put onto the battlefield to get the value off of his ability. And we have 13 removal spells, 4 counterspells, and 36 lands. The last thing I want to say before getting into the deck is if you enjoy this video and you want to see more, hey, please hit that like button. I'm not making money for doing this. I'm mostly here just to help the community. So when I see people like my video, it's a huge inspiration for me to keep making more. So please hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos, please hit that subscribe button. So let's start actually with the flicker / enter the battlefield multiplier effects, because those are really important for this deck. So Voyager Staff is 1 mana for an artifact that says you can pay 2 and sacrifice it to exile target creature and return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So again, when you're flickering, the permanent enters the battlefield again, which is going to trigger Kodama again. What I love about Voyager Staff is that it's only 1 mana at first, and then you can just hold it up, right? And you can just wait till someone tries to target your creature with removal, and then flicker it. Essence Flux is 1 blue for an instant. Exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it's a spirit, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Hey, guess what? Kodama's a spirit. Next is Ghostly Flicker, 2 and a blue for an instant. Exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, and then return those cards to the battlefield under your control. So what's great about Ghostly Flicker is it can also hit lands, which kind of has those lands enter the battlefield untapped again, right? It's like not exactly ramp, but it does kind of help pay for itself, which is cool. Next is Panharmonicon, 4 mana for an artifact. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So keep in mind that Panharmonicon isn't going to double replacement effects. So if we had Master Biomancer in the deck, his ability is a replacement effect. It's not actually an enter the battlefield effect, so we don't have Master Biomancer. Next is Conjurer's Closet, 5 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of your end step, flicker something, right? Just once every one of your turns, you get to flicker something. That's great. Alright, on to the creatures. So almost all of our creatures have some kind of enter the battlefield effect. Elvish Pioneer is 1 green for a 1/1 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may put a basic land from your hand into play tapped. Arboreal Grazer is 1 green for a 0/3 Beast with Reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand on the battlefield tapped. Sylvan Ranger is 1 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Scout. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Having lands go to our hand is really not bad at all in this deck because, again, Kodama can put those lands onto the battlefield for us. Next is Voracious Hydra, X green for a 0/1 Hydra with Trample. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Either double the number of +1/+1 counters on it, or it fights target creature you don't control. So again, if you have Panharmonicon out, you're not going to double the +1/+1 counters on it that it initially gets. Remember, that's the replacement effect. That's not actually an enter the battlefield effect. However, when it enters the battlefield, choose 1, that will happen twice. So you can both double the counters and have it fight, or you can do either one of them twice. Really great. Next is Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, 1 and 2 green for a 2/3 Elf Scout. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. And for a green and tapping it, you add X mana in any combination of colors where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This can both ramp and draw cards, and the card draw is on an enter the battlefield effect. Next is Elvish Harbinger, 2 and a green for a 1/2 Elf Druid. When Elvish Harbinger enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an Elf card, reveal it, and then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it, and it taps to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So there are actually quite a few elves in this deck. Probably the most important is Selvala, and then we also have Edric, Spymaster of Trest, 1 a green and a blue for a 2/2 Elf Rogue, and it says whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. Not only can this draw us cards, but it'll also incentivize our opponents to attack each other. Next is Courser of Crewfix, 1 and 2 green for a 2/4 Centaur, and it's an enchantment creature. You play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play the top card of your library if it's a land card, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. I know it seems like this is ramp, but it's technically not. It's not giving you an extra land drop. What it's doing is it's allowing you to play lands from your deck instead of from your hand, and that means your hand is going to stay bigger. So anything that lets you play cards from the top of your library, whether they're lands or not, is card advantage. Next is Runic Armasaur, 1 and 2 green for a 2/5 dinosaur. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. Sometimes this isn't drawing you much, but very often this will be drawing you like at least 2 or 3 cards. Pretty good. Next is Eternal Witness, 1 and 2 green for a 2/1 Human Shaman. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Next is Thassa, God of the Sea, 2 and a blue for a 5/5 legendary enchantment creature god with Indestructible. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa is not a creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, and for 1 and a blue, target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. This is mostly in here for that at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1. That is really good. Just keeping control of what cards we're going to draw. That last ability is highly underestimated. Giving creatures unblockable is very game ending. And yeah, also just having a 5/5 Indestructible is not bad either. Next is Fierce Empath, 2 and a green for a 1/1 elf. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. We got quite a few of those creatures in this deck. Next is Farhaven Elf, 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Next is Spring Bloom Druid, 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a land. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. And then we have Curion Trailblazer, 3 and a green for a 1/2 elf, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So all 3 of these are basically doing the exact same thing. They're all netting you 1 extra land on the battlefield, which is exactly what we need in this deck. We need a lot of ramps so we can eventually cast Kodama. And if Kodama's already out, then his ability could be allowing you to put more lands on the battlefield at the same time. Next we have Nissa, Vastwood Seer, 2 and a green for a 2/2 elf scout. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, you exile Nissa, then return her to the battlefield transformed into Nissa Sage Animist, which is a planeswalker that starts with 3 loyalty. For +1, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. -2, put a legendary 4/4 elemental creature token named Ashaya, the Awoken World, onto the battlefield, and for -7, untap up to 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures, and they're still lands. So, this is mostly in here for her enter the battlefield ability, and for that +1 ability, which is just both ramp or card draw, whichever one the card ends up being, and yeah, gets you a land into your hand. Very nice. Next is Thassa, Deep Dwelling. 3 and a blue for a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. It's not a creature unless your devotion to blue is 5 or more. At the beginning of your end step, you flicker one of your creatures, and for 3 and a blue, you tap another target creature. So Thassa getting you a free flicker at every one of your end steps. Next is Tangled Florahedron, 1 and a green for a 1/1 elemental that taps to add 1 green mana to your mana pool, or you can choose to have this enter the battlefield as a tapped land. So this is awesome, goes in pretty much every green deck I've made lately. It's either ramp or it's a land, whichever one you want. Next is Champion of Ronis, 3 and a green for a 3/3 Jackal Warrior. You may exert it as it attacks. When you do, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. So Champion of Ronis can help us cheat out huge creatures for free, just for attacking, and we do have quite a few of them in the deck. Next is Glasspool Mimic, 2 and a blue for a 0/0 Shapeshifter Rogue. You may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter in addition to its other types, or you can choose to have this enter as a tapped land. Again, this is just another one of those, dual flip lands where it's just like, why not include this in the deck? It's great. Next is Ondu Giant, 3 and a green for a 2/4 Giant Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. You notice that almost all these creatures that do this are all druids. It's kind of funny. Next is Kazandu Mammoth, 1 and 2 green for a 3/3 elephant, and it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, or you can choose to have this enter as a tapped land. So this is great with Kodama of the East Tree. We're going to get lots of landfall triggers with Kodama's ability. And again, it's just another why not card, right? Why not include this in the deck? It's great. The only downside is that if it is a land, it'll enter the battlefield tapped. Not bad at all. Next is Elvish Piper, 3 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Shaman, and for a green and tapping it, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Just another way to cheat out huge creatures onto the battlefield. Next is Beast Whisperer, 2 and 2 green for a 2/3 Elf Druid. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So keep in mind that spell doesn't need to resolve, it's on cast. So even if they counter your creature, you're still going to draw a card. Next is Keeper of Fables, 3 and 2 green for a 4/5 cat. Whenever 1 or more non-human creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. Most of the creatures in this deck are not humans. There's only a few humans. Next is Orin Frostfang, 3 and 2 green for a 2/6 snake. And it says attacking creatures you control have Death Touch. And whenever any creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So this is obviously strictly better than Keeper of Fables. I like to have both of them in the deck though. Next is Blizzard Strix, 4 and a blue for a 3/2 snow creature bird with flash and flying. When Blizzard Strix enters the battlefield, if you control another snow permanent, exile target permanent other than Blizzard Strix. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So as long as you control a snow permanent, you get to flicker something. And guess what? We're running snow lands in this deck. Next we have Elder Gargaroth, 3 and 2 green for a 6/6 beast with vigilance, reach, and trample. Whenever it attacks or blocks, choose one. You either create a 3/3 beast creature token, gain 3 life, or draw a card. I would think most of the time we'd probably be drawing cards. Of course, a lot of the time we might want to make those beast tokens to block. I doubt we'll usually be gaining life, maybe sometimes. But yeah, making those beast tokens is another trigger off of Kodama of the East Tree, and just in general, great card draw. Next is Garruk's Pack Leader, 4 and a green for a 4/4 beast. Whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Some more card draw stamped right on a creature. Like I said, green has so many creatures that ramp and even draw cards. It's insane. Next is Deadeye Navigator, 4 and 2 blue for a 5/5 spirit with Soulbound. So you may pair this creature with another unpaired creature when either enters the battlefield. They remain paired for as long as you control both of them. And as long as Deadeye Navigator is paired with another creature, each of those creatures have 1 and a blue flicker this creature. That's just awesome. Just insane. Just 1 and a blue flicker, flicker, flicker. If you can continually flicker, you can eventually put like your whole hand onto the battlefield with Kodama. It's awesome. Next is Woodland Bellower, 4 and 2 green for a 6/5 beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a non-legendary green creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. What I really like is this puts that creature right onto the battlefield, right? So it's a 2-for-1 all by itself. If you have Kodama out, it's a 4-for-1, right? Because it's going to trigger Kodama, and the creature that it brings into the battlefield is also going to trigger Kodama. So 4-for-1 if you have Kodama and then you play this. Next is Regal Behemoth, 4 and 2 green for a 5/5 lizard. I believe it's been updated to dinosaur. Anyway, it's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. And whenever you tap a land for mana while you're the monarch, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So being the monarch in this deck is great because we have so many creatures, it's going to be really hard for our opponents to steal it from us. And yep, we just want that extra card draw. Next is Aetherling, 4 and 2 blue for a 4/5 shapeshifter. So Aetherling has 4 abilities. The first ability is 1 blue, flicker it. Next we got 1 blue, and it's unblockable. Next we got 1 of anything, it gets +1/-1, or 1 of anything, it gets -1/+1. So this creature flickers itself. So if you have Kodama on the battlefield, just as much blue mana as you have, you can keep flickering this and then just keep putting permanents on the battlefield with Kodama. And with its +1/-1 ability, you can activate that at instant speed, dealing your opponent up to 8 damage if this gets unblocked. It can become an 8/1 at instant speed. Next is Affectionate Indrik, 5 and a green for a 4/4 beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So this is, I like to say, the green version of Ravenous Chupacabra, right? Just enters the battlefield, hopefully destroys target creature. 4 damage is usually enough to kill something. Next is Primordial Sage, 4 and 2 green for a 4/5 spirit. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may draw a card. Sweet. And now we're getting into the big guys. Sweet Gum Recluse, 4 and 2 green for a 0/3 spider with Flash, Cascade, and Reach. And when it enters the battlefield, put 3 +1/+1 counters on each of any number of target creatures that entered the battlefield this turn. So in this deck, with that Cascade ability, you usually are going to hit a creature because we got a ton of creatures, and if you happen to have Panharmonicon out, that is double those enter the battlefield triggers, so that's going to be 6 +1/+1 counters on all the creatures that enter the battlefield this turn. Next is Kogla, the Titan Ape, 3 and 3 green for a 7/6 legendary ape. When it enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and whenever it attacks, destroy target artifact or enchantment defending player controls every time it attacks, and for 1 and a green, you can return a human you control to its owner's hand to give Kogla indestructible until end of turn. So like I said, we do got a few humans in the deck that we might want to return to our hand so we can cast them again and re-trigger Kodama. This is mostly in here as just a really big creature that also counts as removal. It fights creatures, it destroys artifacts and enchantments. I love it. Next is World Breaker, 6 and a green for a 5/7 Eldrazi. When you cast World Breaker, exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. It has reach, and for 2 and a colorless, you can sacrifice a land to return World Breaker from your graveyard to your hand. I'm just now realizing I maybe need to put more sources of colorless mana in this deck just for World Breaker. I do have a few, but most importantly, just a really big creature with reach, and it exiles an enchantment, artifact, or land. Next we have Thorn Mammoth, 5 and 2 green for a 6/6 elephant with trample, and whenever Thorn Mammoth or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Thorn Mammoth fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. Remember, up to 1 means you can choose 0, so you don't have to have this fighting things if you think it's going to die or something. But yeah, all those creatures entering the battlefield is just going to be more and more fighting for Thorn Mammoth. Next is Nezahal, Primal Tide, 5 and 2 blue for a 7/7 Elder Dinosaur with a ton of text. It can't be countered, you have no maximum hand size, whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell you draw a card, and finally you can discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal, and then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So Nezahal not only draws you a ton of cards, not only is it a 7/7, not only can't it be countered, it also flickers itself. It flickers itself with that last ability. That's excellent. Next is Tidespout Tyrant, 5 and 3 blue for a 5/5 Djinn with flying, and whenever you cast any spell, return target permanent to its owner's hand. So this is really annoying for your opponents. Every time you cast something, you're bouncing something back to their hand, and of course, we can use it to bounce our own things back to our hands, so we can trigger Kodama again when we recast them. Next is Apex Altasaur, 7 and 2 green for a 10/10 dinosaur. When it enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and it has Enrage, so whenever it's dealt damage, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So you can just keep having this fighting, right? Because every time it fights, it's going to be dealt damage, and then it can fight again, and then it can fight again, and then it can fight again, right? So you just keep having it fighting until you're done, or it dies. Next is Apex Devastator, 8 and 2 green for a 10/10 Chimera Hydra, and it has Cascade, 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 Cascade. So this is a 5 for 1. For 10 mana, for sure, but you do also get a 10/10. It's just insane. Alright, so that's it for the creatures. Now into some card advantage. We have Garruk's Uprising, 2 and a green for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Next is Elemental Bond, 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Rhystic Study is, of course, 2 and a blue for the most famous enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. You gonna pay? Next is Guardian Project, 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature in your graveyard, draw a card. So in Commander, Guardian Project basically means every single non-token creature is going to draw you a card, because obviously we don't have multiple copies of any creature in our deck. Next is Seagate Restoration, 4 and 3 blue for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game, or you can choose to have this enter the battlefield as a land that enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. This can draw you a ton of cards, and having no maximum hand size is really important with Kodama, so we can make sure we always have things in our hand. We don't want to be discarding anything. Next is Recurring Insight, 4 and 2 blue for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in target opponent's hand, and it has Rebound. So on your turn after you cast this, you get to cast it again for free. This card has drawn me so many cards for just 6 mana. I mean, all the time you have an opponent with 7 cards in their hand, you know? So all the time, this will be drawing you 14 cards. I would say the least amount of cards this has drawn me is 10. And that's because, yeah, my opponents only had a maximum of 5 cards in their hand. Still, 10 cards for 6 mana, such a good deal. Such a good deal. Goes in pretty much every blue deck I've ever made. Next is the Great Henge, 7 and 2 green. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. It does tap to add 2 green mana to your mana pool, and you gain 2 life, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and draw a card. So this can be as little as just 2 mana to cast, and yeah, this ramps, it gains you life, it pumps your creatures, and it gives you card advantage. It's just everything in one. Great card. So next we got a couple more ramp spells, not many because most of the creatures are our ramp spells, but of course we have Soul Ring and we have Thought Vessel. Thought Vessel is just 2 mana for an artifact that says you have no maximum hand size and you can tap it for a colorless. So it's ramp and we just need no maximum hand size in this deck, absolutely. Next we got the removal, starting with Kalani Ambush, 2 and a green for an instant. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, or you can choose to have this enter the battlefield as a tapped land. Next is Cyclonic Rift, 1 and a blue for an instant. Return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, or you can choose to pay this for its overload cost for 6 and a blue, and if you do that, then you return all non-land permanents you don't control to their owner's hands. What I love to do with the instant speed bounce spells like Cyclonic Rift is I wait until my opponent's end step, and then I bounce everything back to their hand, and then they have to discard down to 7. Next is Aetherize, 3 and a blue for an instant, return all attacking creatures to their owner's hands. A great way to save yourself from lethal damage. Next is Evacuation, 3 and 2 blue for an instant, return all creatures to their owner's hands. Again, another instant. River's Rebuke, 4 and 2 blue for a sorcery, return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. So this does only affect one of your opponents, but doing this to just one opponent is usually enough to get you safe. And then we got Azuri's Predation, 5 and 3 green for a sorcery. For each creature your opponents control, put a 4/4 green beast creature token onto the battlefield, and each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. So this is going to be dealing 4 damage to each of your opponent's creatures. Definitely the best green board wipe in the game, and it gets us a ton of creatures. And we got some other stuff. We have Bela Get Recovery, 2 and a green for a sorcery. Return target card from a graveyard to your hand, or you can choose to have this enter the battlefield as a tapped land. And of course, we gotta have Rite of Replication, 2 and 2 blue for a sorcery, and it has Kicker for 5, so you may pay an additional 5 as you cast the spell, and you put a token on the battlefield that's a copy of target creature, but if it was kicked, you put 5 of those tokens on the battlefield instead. So all the time, Rite of Replication all by itself can win you the game. You know, if your opponent has Brawn, or if they have some crazy dragon that deals damage when it enters the battlefield, it's just has so much value. You know, imagine if we played this on that dinosaur, that 10/10 dinosaur that fights things. You know, we get 5 10/10s, that'd just be insane. So, Rite of Replication, don't underestimate it. Definitely, this is a card that can win you the game all by itself. Turntimber Symbiosis is 4 and 3 green for a sorcery. You look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them on the battlefield. If that card has converted mana cost 3 or less, it enters with an additional 3 +1/+1 counters on it, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, or you can choose to have this enter the battlefield as a land that enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. Being able to put a creature directly onto the battlefield with this card is really powerful. I really like this card. Being able to choose from 7 cards, get the best creature, put it on the battlefield, I think that's fabulous. And even if you get a small creature, it enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. And we have a few counter spells. We have whatever it's called, Disruption. 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. Or you can have it enter the battlefield as a tap land. Tail's End is 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or legendary spell. So this can counter any commander. It always has something it can counter. Next is Void Slime, a green and 2 blue for an instant. Counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. And then we have Heroic Intervention, which is not a counter spell, but, you know, it's basically nullifying your opponent's board wipe, right? So 1 and a green for an instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. And then we have 36 lands. And like I said, we have the snow lands. The only land worth mentioning is Reliquary Tower, because it says you have no maximum hand size. And again, that's really important in this deck. So that is it. That is my Kodama of the East Tree with Esior, Wardwing Familiar Commander deck. So let me know what you think. What would you do differently? What cards would you put in the deck? What cards would you take out of the deck? And again, if you like this video, hey, please hit that like button. I really appreciate it. This is Eric from Monk Punk Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.